Well, with a minimum amount of toing and froing, I got those shutter speeds very good. And I found two potential replacements for that missing lever. Both of them are missing their spring. So I've got to find a return spring for that lever, which is considerably easier said than done. If I can find a return spring, I can fit those, or one of those. If I can't find a return spring, I'm going to have to do more hunting. I have got some complete shutters that I can pillage for parts, but as you probably realise, I'm somewhat reluctant to break up a complete shutter in order to furnish one part. I'll be back. I was able to find a spring and I have fitted that lever. So now I can fit the shutter speed settings cam plate in place. I did check the shutter speeds. They were just very slightly fast. So I adjusted the position of the pin on the top of the retard gear train. Moved it very slightly inwards, slightly outwards rather, to slow the shutter speed down. Then it was running too slow, so there was a bit of toing and froing at getting the angle of the pin just right, but the speeds were so close to correct when I started it didn't make sense to move the retard gear train in order to correct them. It made sense to adjust the angle of the pin on the top there where it contacts this cam. I'll just run a little bit of molybdenum paste down there, and this can go on the shutter, and we can put the retainer on there. We can get it to start. That's all working as it should. Let's set that to 1 second. Set the self timer. Release the shutter. Self timer is running down. And the shutter fires. So this is starting to look hopeful now. The shutter case, I can put it back into there. I'll clean this. Now the flash contact was out of position when we started. One of the screws was missing. One of the screws had been used elsewhere on the shutter in error. So we've got that back again. The curved pusher and the curved rack. The rack acts on that pusher and the pusher acts on the lever and the shutter. Both of these parts need a very light wipe with molybdenum paste. No more than a dirty mark. And pop them into the case. Like that. And if I cock the shutter, I should be able to fit this into here. We'll roll this round. Now that flash contact needs to come up in there, so well, that screw's done up tight. That's why that was never going to go right. slacken that screw off. Get that flash contact to roll round into there. And it has. And then we've got our 3 screws that hold this together. One in the centre and the 2 others. Now these are different diameters. One's a larger diameter than the other. The finer of the 2 screws goes over here and the larger diameter screw goes over here. When we started, we had the smaller screw over here where it wasn't doing any good at all because it was too small to do the job and there was nothing in that position at all. Well, that's good. The flash contact's in place, so I can just do up that screw lightly to clamp that. And there's our shutter assembled basically completely. Now I can put the control rings on the front of the shutter. I need to have a look at these components and see what we've got. That's quite dirty. That number plate, you could hardly read that. I don't know whether that was intentional. Somebody has certainly cleaned this before, at least to a certain extent, because they are usually exceptionally well buttered with graphite grease, most of which is doing absolutely nothing of any use. But whoever was in that part of the assembly line in the decal shutter factory must have had a big pot of graphite grease, and they weren't afraid to use it. This couples the follower for the aperture settings that the numbers that you can see. This couples it to the actual mechanism that moves the diaphragm blades. Now I'm just rubbing that to remove the lumps and bumps because that's a bit of surface corrosion there, but it shouldn't cause us any problems. It's not on a surface that moves relative to anything. This lower surface does, because that where it fits into the groove in the plate and revolves. So I'm running some molybdenum paste around inner and outer and lower surfaces, and this can pop into here. It's our follower with the numbers. I'll just clean that. On the early shutters there wasn't. The aperture numbers were only red at the bottom of the shutter. You just had a match dot at the top. Here's our shutter. Let's take this. This tag on here has to go down to the slot on that lever. That's all looking good. It's coupled correctly with the shutter speed settings cam plate and the aperture settings down here. This it's got a little notch in it which picks up a little tab on the top of that piece there. Our click stops for the shutter speeds click over these little indentations. I'm just giving them a wipe of molybdenum paste. Revolve this until it falls into position. That's right there. Get the retaining ring in place. Of course the retaining ring's been giving me grief trying to get that started. Will it go? Yeah, I think it's going to go. You'll notice I'm manoeuvring the retaining ring with a toothpick, not the end of a screwdriver, because it's very easy to scratch and make a mess of. You want this down snug, but not so snug that the settings are stiff. That's probably a good position, and I'll put the tiny lock screw in here to lock that position in place. The screw is very frequently missing, and we're lucky to have it in this case. It's a very short screw. It's difficult to get in place, and as a result is often lost or thrown away because people don't know what to do with it. Right, clean and put the lenses back on now. I'll just clean the front and rear lens components. The lens is quite clean and looks to be in good order. That's our front component. I'll just blow that off. When you're putting this back in place, make sure you line up the red dot with the red dot. It clips into place. That looks very nice. And the rear group, do the same to that. Just blow that dust off that glass. This looks quite clean as well. It's likely that whoever had the shutter apart had cleaned this. I'll screw that in place. I want to have another go at the outer surface here. The inner surface looks good, the outer surface, a little bit of a few smears there that I'd like to see the back of, so we'll just have another go at this. That looks very good. Now, as previously noted, the number plate on the front of the shutter here is supposed to correspond to your lens set, and it matches the rear group. The front group's a foreigner. Does that matter? Well, it may mean that there's a slight shift in point of focus. Now look at that shimmering there. It's got quite a bend in that. I don't know how that was done. These shims, I need to clean all these because these will be oily. They always tend to be oily. But that shimmering there, it's got quite a mark in it. Let's see if I can get these things clean. The paper shims in particular, the paper shims are quite fragile. Of course, they're somewhat more absorbent than the metal shims. The shims would have been used to match a lens set or a shutter and lens assembly to a body. This one here, I'm going to have to straighten that up. That's pretty bad. To find the right pliers for that. Okay, so let's get these shim rings on here. I'll start with the thinner metal one, put the paper shims on, put the thicker metal one on the top. I've just cleaned the retainer ring. Now I'm going to fit this to the camera body. I'll be interested to see if the focus is correct, and it could be. I don't know what work was done to this camera other than that which we see clearly in front of us. Let's get that cocking curved rack round in roughly the right position. Let's see if we can cock the shutter. We can. That sounds like it's cocking at the right point too, so I'm pleased with that. I'm going to put the retainer ring in place and do it up. I'm going to test the focus. Mostly I really wanted to see if the camera actually would cock and fire. Well, we've already achieved that, we know it does, which is a good result. Let me get this retaining ring started, then I'll find the spanner. Right, back shortly. So, we have a camera that winds and fires. That's a good result. It means that the shutter cocking rack in the camera is in a useful state, which we wouldn't have known beforehand because we were getting absolutely no joy out of that shutter. The shutter appears to work nicely. I'm going to strip the entire camera body down and service it, but I'm not expecting many surprises. Mostly because it appears to work well. I know that the rangefinder is extremely cloudy, very difficult to see through. That's not at all uncommon, and it means that nobody has serviced that, which in this case is probably a bonus, given their skills with camera repair. I'm just going to check the focus on this and see if it focuses well, whether at infinity the images appear to be sharp on at the film plane, and they may or may not be. These lens sets, they would have been matched at the factory. Now what did that mean? Well, it probably didn't mean they went to the extent that they were choosing front and rear components which produced the minimum of chromatic aberration or something else as exotic as that. But it probably meant that front and rear component sets were matched to give an overall focal length that was as within tolerance, as close as possible to the marked focal length. And that's probably all it meant. So it means that when you have mismatched numbers, potentially your focus may be incorrect because the lens potentially, the front and rear combination, may be slightly greater or slightly less in terms of its focal length. So that's what I need to discover. Well, I've just checked that, and the lens does not focus to infinity. There are too many shims in there for that to focus to infinity, so I'm going to remove shims until such stage as I get correct focus at infinity. Very interesting. I tested that. I removed the thickest of the shims, the one that looked a little bit strange and the one that had the crease in it, and magically that's all it was. That most likely never belonged in the camera. How it found its way in there is anyone's guess. That being said, I noticed some other fault. it's something to do with the shutter. On other speeds, the shutter appears to release correctly and the shutter release returns correctly to the up position. But on the B setting, the shutter release tends to stick down. It's not returning correctly on the B position. There's some friction there. I've already determined it's in the shutter, not in the body. So I think we'll better deal with that. So back into the shutter. Probably means something slightly bent. Let's see if we can figure it out. Now there may be too much friction at that point. Let's try that. No, that doesn't appear to be it. So I thought it was rubbing at that point, but that's not it. It may be just rubbing underneath this shutter speed settings cam plate. Let's try slackening that off and see what happens if we reduce the pressure on this slightly. That's it. This shutter speed settings cam plate is probably bent down slightly at the edge and it's rubbing on that arm. That works perfectly now. So we'll have that plate off and check it for flatness. So I think that's our answer. And it appears that it's bent down at that edge. I'll have another look at this arm, see if there's anything odd about it. Its return spring is tucked in correctly. And you can certainly see scuff marks on it at that point. Alright, well I'll do some work on this plate and then put it back. Well, that's working nicely now. So just a minor problem there and quickly dealt with. So the shutter and lens assembly is good. We know the focus is good. Means that this shimmering, wherever it appeared from, was probably never part of this camera. And the focus of the lens is good, even though it's a mismatched serial number set. It's fine. There's no problem there at all. So given that information, we've now got a shutter that works correctly. I can get in and strip down and clean the body on this camera. I don't know that you need to come along for the ride on that one because I'm not really expecting any serious surprises there. Though I'll bring you in if I find any. I'm just doing a stock take before I dive into the camera body. We have our shutter all complete and I'm happy with the state of that. I had to add that little lever with its spring. I had to replace a screw that had been stripped out and I had to replace one screw that was missing. So we have this screw here which had previously been stripped out of the mechanism plate, but the screw itself is fine. This is the screw from the end of the top housing, and this screw is one of the two screws that held the metered settings dial on the top in place, which is not currently there. So hopefully there's not too much missing in here, so I'm just going to spin off that rewind knob. Now I've already noted that the top of that's bent, so I'm going to have to see if I can straighten that up. Yeah, the screw's bent. You can see that looking at that screw runs off at a funny angle. I'll see if I can fix that. You can see here from the position of this rewind, it's been pushed over that way. That means that the bush is loose and it's probably bent. There's a screw missing here. That's unusual. Let's get these two screws out of the top cover at the end here anyway. So the camera's had a hard life. Generally speaking, when the meter settings dial's missing, it indicates the camera's been dropped. Certainly you can see by these two indentations on the top of the meter housing here that the camera had been dropped on its head and those screws had been driven down into the top of the meter. Let's start here. We'll remove the exposure meter. The flap on the exposure meter doesn't move correctly. That would be another indication that the camera's been dropped, of course. That screw is loose. Lift the meter off. Something odd there. That screw head's chewed up. Means someone's been poking around in the meter at some stage. Now there's not many good reasons to do that. I don't know that the meter's accurate. I'll be very surprised if it is. But at least it works. And we all like to have things that swing around and look like they're doing something. Let's have the rangefinder off. And we can take that off. I'll put springs and things in another container. There's our shutter release button. Have the strap plug off the end of the body at this end. Those screws are quite loose. The strap plug off here. That screw is not loose. Let's take this strap off. And this post. That's the guide post for the film release button. Doesn't look mutilated. Lift that plate. One shim washer underneath it. Put that carefully to one side. Tiny washers tend to get a bit lost in the cleaning process if you're not careful. Here's the crocking rack. Everything here is covered in an even layer of grime. I won't know the condition of that until I've got it all clean, though we do know that it worked. Most likely it will be fit to use again. I'll take off that little C-clip and remove the spring. That's the lock lever that holds the shutter and the film advance locked at the end of the film. Now here's our shutter release shaft. Now it has a tiny spacer washer on there that I'm going to be careful not to lose. Another washer, a spacer, and then the shaft itself. They'll go through the cleaner. Single screw at the top here. This is the release shaft that releases the film advance to allow you to wind on once you've depressed the shutter. Our rewind shaft here, now I noted that that's bent over. You can certainly see it's bent over there. I will have to apply a little bit of body English on that one, I'd say, to see if I can square that up. Well, I'll attempt to square it up with a judicious thumping. If it doesn't screw up, then I'll have to find another one, but there's no point replacing what can be repaired. Take that all apart, and at the top of the camera, what are we left with? Well, got that screw on the top there, we'll have that out. Although I've said that there's, you know, dust and grit and the usual filth in here, it's not a bad example by any means, it's a good example. Oh, that screw's loose. Yeah, that would have led to a failed cocking rack fairly promptly. That shoulder screw supports the cocking rack, and if it's loose, the cocking rack can push away and almost inevitably gets damaged pretty promptly and fails. Okay, so that's the top of the camera. At the base of the camera, now we come to the leatherettes.